hadn't tomorrow. I noticed that it had started early though. So I'm very honored to be here, especially with this group. When I talk about Franklin Park, you would be surprised. I have to often, even with audiences in the city of Boston, explain that Franklin Park is a very special place. It's a very significant park. I even have to explain where Franklin Park is, and this is in the city of Boston, but not today, not with this group. I'm very pleased to be talking to a group that's so knowledgeable about the park, that lives around it, that uses it, that loves the park. And so I'm going to talk to you a little differently than I talk to those groups because I have a knowledgeable audience for a change. You're here because it's your park. You know it, you love it, and you use it, you visit it. And I think we also all share certain conviction about how important this place is. And so maybe it is worth spending some time on a beautiful Saturday afternoon to discuss its past, but also its future. And I do hope to get to discussion. I'm going to try to keep this briefer than I sometimes do so that we can get to a discussion about the future. So thank you for being here. I'm very aware of sort of the privilege I am granted talking to a group of people about their own park, and I will try to do my best. But it is worth it. As Gretchen was alluding to, the park is at a turning point in its history. I think we all know there are tens of millions of dollars that have been proposed for construction projects in Franklin Park. I mean, tens of millions is probably, it's more like 100 million if you add it all up. And that's a spectacular opportunity. It's also potentially very dangerous, right? That's a lot of money in construction. And we're talking about the Shattuck Hospital, of course, the redevelopment proposal there, the renovation of the Playstead Stadium, whatever form that takes. And most importantly, in my opinion, the restoration of the Elma Lewis Playhouse in the park. And that's a project I'd like to talk about a little bit more as we get toward the end of this presentation. I think it's extremely important for a lot of reasons. But taken together, this is a major change, turning point for Franklin Park, which is why I wrote this book, which is published by the Library of American Landscape History, by the way. And we have a representative, the president of the board, who's kind enough to attend, Keith Morgan. And it's also why I acted as a historical consultant for the action plan that was led by Gary Hildebrand's shop, the Reed Hildebrand Landscape Architects, because I recognized what was coming. And I really believe that a more thorough consideration of the past of this park was needed to have a solid way of thinking about its future. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. But in any case, we can all agree it's a great park. I don't have to tell you that. And we can also agree perhaps that this is a vitally important moment to get it right, to really understand what makes this park great and how construction projects might or might not impact that greatness. So looking here, and Gretchen, you can advance me for the rest of the world. This is an 1885 plan for the park set in the city as it exists today. The gold star marks where you are, just like in the shopping mall. And this is really how we need to see it today. A place that has evolved over time as the neighborhoods around it have grown and also evolved over time, which is why the book is as much about the 20th century as it is about the 19th century. I think a lot of people are very familiar with the name Frederick Olmsted and the 19th century history of the park. The 20th century history of the park is absolutely as important for understanding where we are today. In this image, you can see in black, I'm not going to try to point because it won't work on a monitor, but you can see in black the black outlines of some of the buildings, like the stadium that was added in 1949, the hospital opened in 1953, the zoo buildings, which mostly date to after 1958, when the zoo was transferred to state jurisdiction. It's actually not parkland anymore, it's state parkland. And today we're talking about the biggest changes to the park since this period of mid-20th century decision-making that led to this wave of major changes in the park. And so we should ask, what has changed since the mid-20th century? What has not changed since the mid-20th century? What should change? What should have changed perhaps, and perhaps has not changed? We can all agree these were decisions made in the mid-20th century and may or may not be the greatest decisions for the park, but it's important to recognize why they were made and what might be different today. All right, but first, it's important to recognize this story did not begin in the 1880s when the city of Boston got involved, and neither did it end there. It began at the end of the last ice age, which the geologists tell me was 12,000 years ago, 15,000, I don't know. It's a long time ago, but it left behind a topography of the drumlin field that would become the geological framework for the park landscape. And in landscape history, we don't have periods of significance the way we might for architectural history or other art history, because you need to go back in geologic time and you need to come up to the present, because that's what landscapes are. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. This history continued over thousands of years of occupation and management by Algonquian speaking people who managed the landscape. They weren't just there, they were burning it, they were clearing it for maize-based agriculture and villages. There was all sorts of selective forestry management for improving game habitat, etc. So I'm acknowledging that thousands of years of history following the end of the last ice age. It really only began to look like it does today relatively recently, when it becomes part of the town of Roxbury in 1630, one of the first towns, of course, of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and starts to be cleared for European, or at least English, agricultural purposes. And so over time, it became the landscape that Olmsted would see in the late 1870s as the new Boston Park Commission was considering it as the site for the largest park of that new system at around 500 acres. I say 518 acres. And if anyone wants to dispute me, you may. There are many different acreages given for Franklin Park, including by the Parks Department. So whether they're counting the sidewalks or not and things like that. But the overall footprint of this landscape, as it was being looked at in the 1870s, was about 518 acres, and a landscape that looked like this: scattered rocks, ledges, some secondary forests, basically upland pasture land, typical of the western portion of Roxbury at the time, scattered orchards, about 2 dozen small farms and small landholding properties. And this was the character that Olmsted insisted should be retained as it became a park. It should be retained, it should be amplified perhaps as it's turned into a park for the city, a large park specifically for the people of the city of Boston. I mean, the idea was simple. This kind of rural, unadorned landscape could provide all Bostonians with the chance to experience the kind of physical and emotional health benefits that rich Bostonians had always enjoyed because they would get out of town. So if you're spending your summers in Maine or New Hampshire or wherever, that's great. But this kind of experience was almost now completely unavailable to people in Boston. They couldn't afford to do that. And so the last piece of rural, regional upland scenery was being identified as a place that would be available and would provide the benefits that other people got from going away for the summer. And that was, a pretty simple idea. Now, a whole park system is being planned, I hasten to add. I'm not quite there yet, Gretchen. Okay. A whole park system was being planned, and that should be recognized. It wasn't just about Franklin Park or just about a large rural park. In other words, there were playgrounds, there were ball fields throughout all the neighborhoods that were being planned, all types of public landscapes. The public garden and the common already existed, of course. And the idea is to spread out many different types of public landscapes for all different types of recreation. It's not an argument about what type of recreation is better. It's about having a comprehensive system that would include this. That would include an opportunity for people to experience rural landscape scenery, even though they were sort of had their lives were restricted to staying in the city of Boston. And so specifically, this would be the large park of the system. It would allow everyone to experience the pleasure and health benefits by preserving undeveloped, and that's really what's happening here, a passage of upland New England scenery. And so the early history of the landscape is actually important because Olmsted doesn't change it that much. It's when you go to Franklin Park today, you're seeing, well, not exactly the same. We can talk about some of the differences, but you're seeing the landscape that he saw, and then in fact had been the result of thousands of years of history before that. It's a piece of Boston before it urbanized, in other words. And this was identified as the only place in the city where you could still do this then. And I would suggest that it still is. It's the only place in the city you can see this landscape of Boston as the relatively rural, undeveloped landscape that was later covered by the neighborhoods around it. All right, so this is why the site was chosen, and it's why, in part, it still has tremendous value. The value of this landscape, it totally exceeds anything that has to do with Frederick Olmsted or anything else. It is a landscape that has remarkably survived in Boston, and there isn't another one. And so we can talk about how important Olmsted's designer, how important he was, but we should really be talking about how important this landscape is. And it is unique in Boston. All right, so I've suggested he didn't change much, which is why this 1884 survey was up. Do I have it? There we go. Sorry, I have to say next slide, right, Gretchen? That 1884 survey was absolutely essential for Olmsted to finalize any design, because the design is completely based on this rather detailed 1884 topographic survey. Simply put, and it is simple. Next. Oh, got me. Thank you. Simply put, and he spells it all out here, and I can't point. I can't leave my post, otherwise they won't see me on Zoom. But you can see on the top, there's a big A, the country park section. And then there are all those other letters to the right on the plan, which are what he called the anti-park, A-N-T-E, not A-N-T-I, which were the greeting and the playstead at the end of the greeting. And that was a wonderful main pedestrian entrance from Blue Hill Avenue out through all sorts of attractions and programming, including concerts, restaurant, play fields, the beginnings of a zoo, which of course was being scheduled to go into Long Crouch Woods, but also having components of it further south in the greeting landscape, and the playstead itself, about 40 acres at the end of all of this, which was for all sorts of things, especially school-age athletics, events of all kinds, civic gatherings of all kinds. And that's the basic idea. The wilderness, of course, is part of the country park and complements the pastoral scenery below as a higher wooded and rocky, picturesque counterpoint to the pastoral beauty of the country park. And it completely follows the topography, what Olmsted described as the natural characteristics of the site. In other words, the high ground, the top of a drumlin, is the anti-park, including the playstead. The country park is the low ground coming down between drumlins, and you have a valley, which he called the Nazingdale, and you have a series of ledges around it, which were existing, of course, wooded ledges or outcrops, from which, and with a circuit drive going all the way around, and having stops at each of those ledges for viewing the country park landscape in the interior. So it's a pretty simple plan. And what results is not the same landscape that it was, but what would be called, to using terminology of the time, an improved version of itself. It would be more stable over time. It would facilitate the enjoyment of existing, as well as some enhanced landscape experiences, and it would facilitate the enjoyment by thousands of people at a time, and at the same time prevent that public from destroying what they came to enjoy. So in other words, you transmute the existing landscape into another version of itself that can do all of that, and you call it a park. Because if you just left it, when thousands of people came at a time, they would trample it to death. So you create circulation systems and for different types of circulation, and you create enhanced views where views need to be open, where views need to be framed. But it's all thoroughly based on the landscape as it was. There's no major regrading. There's no major underpasses and overpasses, and you know what I'm talking about, right? Central Park and Prospect Park. Central Park in New York, Prospect Park in Brooklyn are the two great urban parks that precede this one. They're often thought of as a group, the three great urban parks that Olmsted designed. Those required to a much larger degree, regrading, soil amendments, underpasses and overpasses. In Central Park, you have the transverse drives, which were fabulously expensive. Franklin Park costs less. It costs a lot less. Now, this is a difference that some people have pointed to sort of put an asterisk by Franklin Park. They say, well, there's three great parks that Olmsted designed, Central, Prospect, and Franklin. And then they put an asterisk by Franklin, but that one, he didn't do as much. So it's not as important. And they're really missing the entire point. This is a master designer late in his career in the 1880s who has learned to do more by doing less, right? Less engineering creates greater effects. This is the greatest pastoral park of all his designs, and it's achieved by doing less, which is something you have to sort of, designers especially have a hard time with that concept because they like to do stuff, but actually as he's aging, he's in his 60s, and he's really in control of his art, he is able to accomplish more with less engineering. And Franklin Park was different from those other two more famous and better funded parks for other reasons as well. One of them is it's far away. And it's a little further. Central Park and Prospect Park are also outside of downtowns, but Franklin Park is out there. We're out here pretty much in the early suburbs of Boston, at least a mile further away from downtown than Central or Prospect Park. And this is a really important point. And points like this are very important to consider when you're considering the future of the park. Franklin Park is a very different context. Because in part it was further away, because in part it's later. So when we're in the 1880s, one more. We're in the 1880s. It's a different point in American urban history. It's later. Franklin Park is in the middle of what Sam Bass Warner described as the streetcar suburbs that many of you live in today. Jamaica Plain, Dorchester, Roxbury. This is a lower density pattern of urbanization that you're familiar with. They're your neighborhoods, lots of wooden 1, 2, 3 family houses, mostly residential in character, relying on streetcars to get to places of employment downtown. It's a very different context than Central or Prospect that are surrounded by much denser pattern of row houses, let's say. These days, corporate headquarters, row houses, apartment buildings, much denser. A lot of those neighborhoods are also wealthy. It creates a very different context for Franklin Park, and that obviously needs to be understood as planners are considering its future. One point that I'll delve into now without going too far is that Prospect and Central have benefited since the 1980s from private funding. Enormous amounts, like hundreds of millions of dollars, have been raised by the conservancies associated with those parks. Will that happen in Franklin Park? The lower density neighborhoods, different character of those neighborhoods, suggest it will not. And so one of the things the Franklin Park Action Plan identifies, to its credit, is that it's really time to look at whether the conservancy model is going to suffice for the future of Franklin Park. So what's the alternative? There's only one alternative I know of. You're not going to raise private money to completely change a park. You're going to rely on municipal funding. And there needs to be a commitment for maintenance and operation, annual budget, not capital budget, for Franklin Park that comes from the city of Boston. And I don't think that's out of line, because as I will talk about in a minute, the park has been underfunded since the 1960s, grievously underfunded. And it's one of the great inequities in the history of the Boston public landscape. And we can discuss why did that happen, and I will. But the point is that it's not unreasonable for the city of Boston to invest in Franklin Park, not just with capital projects, but with increased funding for maintenance and operations. I mean, it's unbelievable how underfunded the park was, especially in the mid-20th century. Another thing people have said about Franklin Park, one more, Gretchen, that it was unfinished. And that's another reason for the asterisk. And what we see here is just that 1885 plan over existing conditions in Google Earth, but you can see where the zoo is and the greeting that was not built is what you're seeing there with the zoo underneath on Google Earth. And what we can see is most of the park actually was built, but the greeting was not built. And the greeting was where all that programming was going to go. And since that programming was never built, there were fewer visitors than people would have liked in the 1890s, let's say, because all of the programming wasn't there. I mean, there wouldn't be many people in Central Park either if there was no programming. All of the things that attract people, and then they can enjoy the larger, beautiful pastoral landscape. But if you don't have attractions, you just end up with low numbers of visitors, and that's what was happening. But the park was finished. It's just not in this form with the greeting. It was finished beginning in 1912 when the first version of the zoo opens. One more. And you can see here the original greeting plan and Arthur Shercliffe's 1912 zoo plan. It's a reiteration, it's a reimagining of the greeting now as a modern zoo in 1912. It creates the grand pedestrian entrance off Blue Hill Avenue that brings people up a great promenade out to the playstead. You can see Long Crouch Woods shown, developed with the bear dens. In fact, a lot of other stuff that wasn't necessarily built. A lot of this wasn't necessarily built, but by creating the zoo as the greeting, they finished the park. And this is Honey Fitzgerald, actually Arthur Shercliffe is the consultant, and a lot of other people were involved at the time. And Franklin Park is complete to a significant degree. It functions. In other words, there's a grand pedestrian. Millions of people a year are coming to the park in the 20s and 30s. There's a grand pedestrian entrance from Blue Hill Avenue. All the parts are together. The zoo, by the way, is unfenced and free to the public, which is a very big difference from what it is today. So very good. It was finished. Correcting some misconceptions here. One more. There's just the greeting when as it was created for the zoo. Another. And then there is the playstead at the end of it all. The playstead was already in use by 1883, long before it officially opened in 1889, and it was being used for a lot of the same things it's used for today. The playstead is the active heart of the park. It has been since 1883. It is the point of congregation, the point of arrival, the point of programming. It is today, because the zoo is fenced and charges over $20 to get in. It is really, as far as public use of Franklin Park, just the critical landscape. It is the critical place where so much happens, so much needs to happen, and in fact, so much has happened over the years. School-age athletics, community events of all kinds. It's worth noting that Olmsted specifically warned against having professional sports teams. Why? Do you have a grudge against them? Not really. It's because professional sports teams required, first of all, they drew 10,000 spectators as opposed to school-age athletics. I don't know if you know about what baseball was like in the 1880s, but it was there was a lot of drinking, a lot of gambling. The police were called. It was so there were reasons why professional sports league weren't going to fit in with the vision of receptive recreation, as he called it, sort of a family-oriented recreation in the playstead. They also require a lot of infrastructure that would have overwhelmed the landscape. And so he had his way, and it was school-age athletics. Now, and the playstead and the Overlook Shelter building, I have a lot of slides here. I'll just keep waving at you, and you can go through them. But the playstead and the Overlook Shelter building, I wanted to talk about briefly, because the Overlook Shelter building is just, in my opinion, the most original landscape structure / building ever built in a park. That is a building that is built into an 800-foot boulder terrace with a tunnel where you enter the lower part of the building from the landscape you see here. The upper part of the building opens up onto the terrace itself, which is the equivalent of a grandstand. The terrace is a viewing terrace for viewing everything that's going on in the playstead, whether it's civic gatherings, school-age athletics, whatever it is. It's just a remarkable building. Can we keep going, Gretchen? Of course, the terrace still survives. It's hard to get rid of an 800-foot long boulder terrace, even if you want to. The building, however, burned in 1945, as many of you probably know. It not only is the center, this is the most important building in Franklin Park, the most important moment in Franklin Park, but it will continue to be when Elmo Lewis revives it in the 1960s and reclaims the ruins of the Overlook Shelter. This is a critical piece of Franklin Park. Highly significant historically, highly significant in the 20th century because of the volunteer activities and the playhouse in the park that started here in the 1960s. It's a really important part of the park. I'd like to just hold on to that thought for a moment, Gretchen. It's a remarkable structure. I mean, just if you're an architectural historian, if you're interested in park design, I mean, this could have been designed today. I mean, it's just a remarkable integration of landscape and structure, remarkably modern in its appearance. Of course, Olmsted designs it mostly because H.H. Richardson, his great collaborator during this period, dies in 1886. They go to construction in 1887. Unfortunately, Richardson isn't there, but I've always thought that Olmsted is basically just trying to do what his friend Richardson would have done, and that's probably a reasonable way to think of it. And so I'm not going to go on and on about it, but it's a critical moment in the park is what the point I'd like to try to make. Let's keep going, Gretchen. And these photographs, I mean, really, that's modern architecture. There's, there are a lot of firms out there today wish they could do this. All right, one more, Gretchen. Thank you. And then, of course, the country park. Asdale is the Central Valley, as it was named, but it was known as the country park, interestingly, because Hugh O'Brien, the Irish mayor of Boston, who gave the Boston Brahmins heart attacks when he was elected in 1884, becomes the great champion of Franklin Park. That's another myth people have, that somehow this was, the whole idea is imposed on the poor working people of Boston by Protestant elites. The Protestant elites actually were fighting against this project when Hugh O'Brien was elected because they were afraid he'd use it for patronage and graft. And so Hugh O'Brien had to go to great extents in order to get the construction money and proceeded to build the park and do it beautifully. Olmsted thought he was great. And so the first Irish mayor of Boston turns out to be the savior of Franklin Park. And the Irish immigrant community in general in Boston was greatly in favor of Boston parks. Because they were some of the principal beneficiaries, right? Brahmins were all, sailing to Maine in the summer. They weren't, what do they care? Oh, anyway, the place that officially opened in 1889, by that time, the country park was also ready to inhabit by sheep. They released sheep. The sheep didn't last long until about 1897. They basically got in the way of the golf, started to be played in 1896. But speaking of golf, let's go ahead. What's amazing about the golf course, right, which is the country park, or the Nazingdale of Franklin Park, is how little it changed the landscape. And I just have to emphasize that because people always say to me, it's another part of the asterisk. Oh, but they built a golf course there. They didn't build a golf course there. The golf course is occupying the country park landscape, but they just laid it out. And in 1922, it was laid out by one of the greatest golf architects in our history, Donald Ross. It's a beautiful golf course because it occupies a really beautiful landscape. It's one of the great municipal courses in the country. And it did remarkably little. The country park is still there, is what I'm trying to say. You go around the circuit drive, you go to the various overlooks, you're looking at the country park landscape. You're benefiting from the enjoyment of pastoral scenery and the golf, so you see golfers instead of sheep. That's geese. So that landscape, in other words, which is golf landscape, by the way, this photograph was taken after, is that landscape, same view towards Schoolmaster Hill. And that's the Nazingdale, and that is Franklin Park. Franklin Park has remarkable integrity. The only real impact is on circulation, because you can't walk across the golf course. And then of course the zoo is fenced off, which is not great. It's really necessary, but not great from a park point of view. The landscape, the topography, the general organization of the vegetation and the views not only in the park and across the country park, but the distant views to the Blue Hills of Milton from Schoolmaster Hill, and looking the other direction. And Olmsted wrote about all this. I don't have to take my word for it. He wrote a lot. You're looking the other way, you have the Arnold Arboretum in the distance, protecting the long views from this high point, relatively high point upland pasture, as well as the composition of the internal views of the park landscape. There's no other urban park Olmsted design that's anything really like this. This has its own significance. It's not Central Park or Prospect Park. It has its own. And speaking of golf, one more. I have to say that this is, in my opinion, one of the most beautiful municipal courses in the country. Um, and I'll talk more about it in just a minute. But it has retained the country park landscape. Not everyone always agrees with me because they think, oh, but it's a golf course. Well, I'm not looking at the golf course. I'm looking at the topography, the vegetation, the overall views, et cetera. And this is from Schoolmaster Hill. We have those lovely picnic bays. All right, one more. So I love this 1920s aerial because it sort of shows the park at a point when all the pieces are there and it's working. You have the golf course now as laid out by Donald Ross, but it's still the country park landscape. You have the zoo, as Arthur Shercliffe has designed it, as a greeting that's unfenced, free, and creates a monumental entrance from Blue Hill Avenue out to the Playstead, which is in full bloom. It's working away with the overlook shelter and the overlook terrace. Does anyone know what that landscape on the lower right is on the other side of Blue Hill Ave? Sorry, Franklin Harambee Park, right? And it's which has been greatly reduced in size because Franklin Field houses were built there in the 50s and 60s. But Frank, what is now Harambee Park, was originally Franklin Fields, was a massive ball field complex that drew 10,000 people on a single day to watch baseball or whatever else they were doing. In other words, that's part of the system. It's acquired in 1891. It's part of the system. It's not that it's not about that one form of recreation is superior to another. It's about having a comprehensive system that is accommodating a wide variety of recreation all over the city. And Olmsted knew that. He was arguing for Franklin Fields before Franklin Park got designed or acquired. The first thing he had to say to the Boston Park Commission was, that's a great place for Franklin Park, or what they then called West Roxbury Park. But you'll need to acquire a big piece of ground for ball fields near the entrance. And they didn't until 1891, but they finally did. And that's how it works. So this idea that some forms of recreation are better than others, or that Olmsted only wanted you to walk around and smell the flowers and didn't want you to play baseball, it's just wrong. What he's saying is, look, this is the one place you can have that. You can have nature in the city. You can have people in the city enjoying natural beauty. And that's vitally important for public health, for emotional and physical health. You can also have all that other stuff in places where it makes sense to have that other stuff, like ball fields. But there's an assertion that places like Franklin Park were necessary to human well-being for people in the city. And not everyone necessarily believes that today. I don't know. But it was an assertion that Olmsted was making, that this type of landscape was necessary to public well-being. And it has been affirmed, by the way, by the last 30 years of social science research. Now, they use different language. They say nature, in a very unironic way. They talk about how human beings need nature and biophilia and stuff like that because they're scientists. And so they have their own way of talking about these things. Olmsted described it mostly in aesthetic terms, that the aesthetic response, the emotional response to these places is what made you feel better. The scientists say, oh, it lowers your blood pressure. Not as much fun. But the fact is, this assertion is important for considering why Franklin Park is of value today. It's important to recognize how this is a unique landscape. This is the culmination of Olmsted's urban park career, and it deserves, without an asterisk, to be in the group with Central and Prospect. In fact, the more you get into it, the more interesting it is. Central and Prospect doesn't do it. It's not really there. You know what I'm talking about if you visited those parks. Have you got a drawing on yours? I didn't mean to annotate. All right, you want to unannotate or do you want me to do it? Okay. It's not appearing there. So anyway, if we look at the last time at this 1885 plan, it is the basis of the park we know today. You can look at the greeting and say, no, it's the zoo, fine. So what? It's sort of the same idea, at least if it wasn't fence, charging admission. And so the park has great historic integrity, which is something else that needs to be emphasized. This park hasn't changed any more in the 20th century than any other large urban park by Olmsted or anyone else. This park hasn't, in fact, it's changed less than Central or Prospect. So there's no question about the historic integrity, as the preservationists would say. One more. And in fact, the landscape is still there. And that's what I really have to emphasize to people who don't know this park. They think, well, Franklin, no, it's still, you look at the Ellicott Dale, you see the country park sort of winding off in the distance. You're not quite sure how far it goes. That's expansiveness. That landscape is still there. And I don't care if they're playing golf in it or any of the other changes that have taken place. The emotional impact of landscape scenery and experience is what I'm talking about. Is that still there? Because if that's still there, the park is still there. It has integrity. All right. I don't need to ask you that because I think you would agree with me. So I'll just move on. Something did happen, though. This park did suffer from a crisis. And it was not because of the original design. It was not because it was unfinished. It was not because of the idea of making nature in the city available to all people was somehow an obsolete or elite idea. It was not because of conflict between so-called active and passive recreation, terms that I still don't understand, but that I assume has something to do with ball fields. It was because the city stopped maintaining it. And why was that? It's an important question. By the 1960s, Roxbury, Dorchester, a lot of the neighborhoods immediately around the park were the center of Black Boston, Black and immigrant Boston. And at the same time, the city stops maintaining the park. So, it's not a coincidence. And I make this pretty clear in the book. There's institutionalized racism in the city of Boston in the mid-20th century. And Boston decides not to maintain Franklin Park because of who's living around it. And yeah, there are other reasons. So I don't mean to be too flippant about this, but there's budget crisis. There's a lot of reasons why Boston was in economic trouble at that period. But it's really one of the great inequities in the history of Boston's landscape, as I say, because maintenance all but disappears. Can you just go through a couple of these with me, Gretchen? These are taken in the 1970s, but when the park is being listed in the National Register, and they inadvertently document what I'm saying. You want the evidence for what I'm saying? It's here. The park stopped being maintained. And again, there were a lot of bad decisions, or shall we say, decisions that we can question. Things like the 1949 stadium, the 1953 hospital, the 1958 transfer of the zoo that leads to its fencing and charging of admission. There was an attitude in place in the mid-20th century that the park was not only didn't need to be maintained, but was now available to be chopped up and redeveloped. Put a stadium here, we'll put a hospital here. The zoo, well, we'll fence it off and pretend it's not in the park. So those were not good decisions for the park. And then you have to ask, what is the motivation of those decisions? And then you have to ask how much has changed. Are we still making decisions that way or not? And if we are still making them that way, then less has changed since the mid-20th century than we like to believe, including attitudes of institutionalized racism that have had bad effects for Franklin Park. So the question again, as we look to the future, is what has changed, what has not, and what should change for Franklin Park? Go through the rest of these and get to Elma Lewis. Really interesting sort of documentation of the park in the 1970s. I don't know why I put so many in. Many of you remember this, so I don't think I needed to. Just one more, I think. Okay, fine. So perhaps the most important chapter in the history of Franklin Park as we look to its future is the most recent chapter, 60 years of stewardship by the communities around the park. I say this because the Elma Lewis Playhouse at the Overlook Terrace in the Playstead has at this point been there longer than the original Overlook. Now, if you consider it opens in 1889, it burns in 1945, 20 years later, Elma Lewis and her volunteers are creating the Elma Lewis Playhouse in the foundation. That's what, over 60 years ago? And there's something highly symbolic about it as well. You know, that Alma Lewis organized volunteers to clean up the ruins when the city of Boston was abandoning the park. And this tradition of theatrical and musical performances was started that continues today. I just think this is highly significant for a discussion of the future of the park. Alma Lewis knew what Olmsted knew and what the city of Boston apparently had forgotten. She saw what the landscape of Franklin Park could mean to the communities around the park and to the people of Boston. Franklin Park, as we know it today, is the product of two visions. One was Olmsted's, the other we can ascribe to Alma Lewis, who sees what this park can be to the communities around it in the 1960s. Through community organizing that eventually leads to the creation of the Franklin Park Coalition, a new era for Franklin Park began. And that, I do treat this in the book, but that is a history that really needs to be written. Needs to be written by someone here, perhaps. And I hope at the very least we're getting someone who's doing oral histories with the participants of the last 60 years of stewardship of the park. The park became and remains central to the cultural, civic, and as we see, also the political life of the Black and immigrant community of Boston. This is another famous slide of the famous Black Panther rally in 1969, which ended peacefully, by the way. But one of the demands was to rename Franklin Park Malcolm X Park. Washington Park got named Malcolm X Park instead. I don't know if that satisfied anyone. But look at the topics. They look like someone came up with this yesterday. You know, it's still very much the same program. Anyway, in any case, the point is the Playstead becomes the site of important political demonstrations, and it still is. You know, the Black Lives Matter protests, the Roe v. Wade protests, they're held in the Playstead. The Playstead has enormous significance for the communities around Boston and for Boston as a whole. One more? And the Alma Lewis Theater, it all begins here. And as I say, it all began in the ruins of this remarkable building that I'm so fond of that burned in 1945. It's just so amazing that this whole thing begins in the foundations, the ruins of that building. And the Alma Lewis Playhouse is created there. The heart of the park is in ruins, and it's literally reclaimed. I mean, you couldn't make it up. One more. And when we look at old pictures of what the Alma Lewis Theater was, this is clearly inspirational for anyone who's thinking about what the Alma Lewis Theater in the Playstead can become. And I'm not suggesting it's this. This was really a temporary stage. I mean, it's a wooden outdoor stage. It's not going to last that long with movable seating, but it's incredibly important. It starts the 60-year tradition. And above all, it's the programming and volunteer work of the Franklin Park Coalition. I don't want to leave out other groups and other individuals and volunteers as well who've kept the park alive, kept it relevant for the last 60 years. And by the way, these facts are recognized in the action plan for Franklin Park. I mean, we're just remarkably fortunate that the action plan was completed and that it really did involve significant and authentic community engagement. Everything that I'm saying is consistent with what's in the action plan. And it's just, you know, thank goodness we have the action plan. We actually have a planning framework to proceed with, except that we don't appear to be doing it necessarily, but we can talk about it. Anyway, I think these are really inspirational images. Can we go through a couple more? Yeah, and the programming. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to move through pretty quickly. I don't mean to give them short shrift. I think this is what the park is about. The programming and activities that have been going on in the Playstead for the last 60 years, and in fact, since 1883. Keep going, Gretchen. Because I want to stop soon. That's Black Lives Matter protest recently. And get to the golfers. And I don't want to leave out the golfers. Because the Franklin Park Coalition is one thing. The Franklin Park Golf Association is formed in 1967, group of Black golfers who literally rescue the golf course because the city had abandoned it and was closing it in the 1970s. And the Franklin Park Golf Association maintains it, plays on it, and that's why it's there. That's why we had a restoration of it in the 1980s. That's why we got a new golf house in the 1990s. And I will add, besides, so it's not just one group. It's not just, there's a lot of different community groups that are rescuing Franklin Park during this period. One more. And I will say that golf and park coexist in Franklin Park better than they do in any similar situation I know of. I'm not saying it can't be improved because I have a number of ways I'd like to improve it. But the fact is, golf and park really coexist here. And it's because the landscape was so perfect for a golf course. I mean, you have the circuit drive going all the way around. None of the circuit drive went through. And so they just laid out the golf course. And now the circuit drive goes around a golf course. So there's more in the book about this and I can talk more about it. But in fact, it was a perfect place to have a golf course without having to redevelop the landscape. So when you're looking at the golf course, you're looking at the country park as a golf course. The result is probably the most beautiful municipal course in the country. It's also one of the socially significant in the social history of Boston and in the social history of the sport of golf, because this course was fully integrated by the 1940s, which other golf courses in this country were not. And so it's a major site in the history of black golf in the United States. Some of you know this. Maybe you didn't. One more, Gretchen. And so this is a familiar scene. This park has never been abandoned. I can't tell you. I have talked to people in the city of Boston who think that this park was abandoned. It was unmaintained, but it was not abandoned. Why do you think they feel that way? Because they are white, they live in a different neighborhood of Boston, and they never come here. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's just the truth. I know a lot of people in Boston who have never been to Franklin Park. I'm talking to you and you're like, and you know what I'm talking about. It's just a fact. It fell off the radar for a lot of white Boston, not Jamaica Plain. I have to add that because I don't want people from Jamaica Plain attacking me after this talk. But it fell off and that's how it fell off the radar for the city of Boston. It stopped being maintained. And by the way, it got shabby historical treatment from people I admire. But they have a tendency to dismiss Franklin Park and put that asterisk by the name. They didn't know they just didn't know very much about the park. They didn't feel like they needed. That's a historical gripe. You don't have to get involved in that. So that leaves us here. Two of the three massive construction projects proposed for the park are in the Playstead. And I can't emphasize how important the Playstead is to this park and to the city of Boston. I'd like to have a couple of observations and open this for a discussion. First observation is about the White Stadium rehabilitation. No one I know is opposed to the rehabilitation of the Playstead Stadium for the school children of Boston. No one. I don't think anyone in this room is. That's why it was built in 1949 for school-age children. That's what the Playstead was originally built for. Recreation, active recreation, athletics for school age. That's why it's called Schoolboy Stadium. Named from a less enlightened time, perhaps, but nevertheless, that's what it's called. The question isn't whether the stadium should be rehabilitated; it's how should it be rehabilitated. Does it require the stadium be the venue for a professional sports team? If the city of Boston is willing to spend $50 million to facilitate a professional sports team taking over the stadium, why aren't they willing to spend $50 million for the school children of Boston? And when they, no, I have to finish, and I don't want to turn this into a rally. But I mean, the fact is, the rehabilitation of the stadium is not only desirable, it's decades overdue. It's living evidence of the neglect, the negligence on the city's part for Franklin Park. And so the question is, why does it require the professional sports team to become, in order for the city of Boston to rehabilitate White Stadium? I have not heard an answer to that question. That's one point. If there's $50 million to invest, why not in school children? Why does it require professional sports? Secondly, This project was proposed after the action plan was completed. And it's outside, and it has been, the process for planning this project has been outside the context of that action plan. That action plan was signed, sealed, and delivered and involved real community engagement. And the number one project it prioritized was the Elma Lewis Playhouse, which we see circled in blue here. Yes, the rehabilitation of the stadium is a great idea, but what is important to the communities around Franklin Park? The Elma Lewis Theater Playhouse project. As a result, the stadium project was planned in isolation, independently from forthcoming plans for the Elma Lewis Theater project. It's immediately adjacent. They're touching each other. The point is that you can't do these two things that both involve thousands of people coming to Franklin Park, both involve major considerations on circulation, parking, park facilities. You can't plan them independent of one another, and you can't plan them outside the context of a rehabilitation plan for the Placedead landscape as a whole, because that's best practice in landscape architecture. It's best practice in historic preservation. And you can't plan it outside of some plan for enhanced funding for annual maintenance and operation budget. That's what the action plan is asking for. And the stadium plan has proceeded outside of that context, which is just a problem because it's going to undermine the future of the Elma Lewis Theater. I mean, these are two projects that should be sharing things. They should be sharing amenities, bathrooms, concessions, gathering places, performance. Together, they could really be a revitalization of the Placedead landscape. It could be a remarkable turning point for Franklin Park, a really great thing. Conceived of separately, they've threatened to be an egregious impact on that landscape. And remember, this landscape is listed in the National Register. When I say best practice in landscape architecture, in historic preservation, I'm alluding to the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of cultural landscapes. This is a Boston landmark. This is a National Register landscape. The Secretary of the Interior standards apply. And the first thing that we would ask for is some kind of understanding of the comprehensive landscape treatment plan, not looking at these projects independently, like we did in the mid-20th century, where there's a site for redevelopment here, a site for redevelopment there. How much has changed and how much has not changed becomes the question. Are we still in the mid-20th century? I hope not, because there was, as I've alluded to, institutionalized racism that led to a series of decisions in Franklin Park as individual sites to be redeveloped. Hospital there, a stadium there. So have things changed? The action plan suggests they have. The city's actions, however, are how we're really going to find out if that's true. Thank you. I'm sorry if I took too long with that. Speak up. Yes. You have to raise your hand. Yeah, we have, stand up, stand up.
It's not just a history book. Thank you for doing a politically informed, very relevant story about the park. I didn't realize it was going to be so politically informed. I guess my question is, have you given this book or this presentation to the mayor?
I sent the mayor a draft of this book before it was published. I have not heard back. I'm a big supporter of the book, by the way. I just am not seeing what's happening at the stadium as being meeting, and I'll retreat to my professional stance here, is not meeting best practices in landscape architecture or historic landscape preservation. It just isn't.
Would you join others in advocacy, or have you joined others in advocacy, making this very historically and planning informed argument?
I participated in the action plan as a historical consultant.
No, I mean advocacy with the city and whatever on various.
Well, I'm on record in the Boston Globe. Stephen Gray and I wrote an op-ed editorial, which was published on Christmas Day, which you should look at. I mean, it says pretty much what I said here. So if that makes me an advocate, I am, but you know, it's not my primary goal. My primary goal is to see these projects realized in the best possible way, because that's what Franklin Park deserves. It's just this lingering,